there's a thing I've wondered about. There's an impression I have on source material, about source material, East versus West source material. And you might not share the same impression, but if you have this impression, maybe you can speak to it, would be, this is a very roundabout way of arriving at the point, but when Randall and I were reading about the long hunters, so this group of Euro-American deerskin hunters that were first pushing over the Appalachian Mountains and going into Kentucky, basically all the country south of the Ohio River, west of the Appalachian Range, south of the Ohio, pushing into that area.
Yeah.
And we kind of marveled at the paucity of materials and the lack of sort of like the lack of natural observation, the lack of nature observation. What is there was collected like very deliberately by a historian who went and talked to some of the key players, children, spouses, grandchildren, and tried to put together a little history of these first Euro-Americans to push into this area.
Yeah.
But there's just not a ton there. And that is at, say, 1776.
Yeah.
What happens in the next 30, 40 years where all of a sudden it seems like everyone is so literate?
Yeah.
And everyone is
are.
just observing and writing about, trying to, writing about the sights they see, counting things, right? Like really putting a record down that now you can look at the West, and part of what's so inviting about it is there's something there to read about.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to get, like, you just, when looking at people coming into Kentucky, for instance, coming into Kentucky, it's like there's hints of things where you're like, you gather it must have been really different, but there's no just vivid pictures of what they're seeing. Did people also learn to read and write? Like how do you explain that?
Well, I explain it in three ways, I guess. One is that starting in 1800, a lot of the expeditions into the West are government expeditions. Mm-hmm. And those people are given specific instructions to keep a record, keep a really close record. I mean, Jefferson tells Lewis and Clark, for example, any animals that you see that aren't found in the maritime states, collect them, write a description, learn as much about their natural history as you can. And I think that's one of the things. I think another thing is that there are a lot of Europeans coming over in the early 19th century, the Thomas Nuttalls, the John Bradburys, and those guys tend to look at darkest North America sort of the way the Brits were looking at Africa then, where, wow, man, this is some amazing part of the world that none of us has ever seen, and so we got to keep a record of all of it. We've got to, we've got to preserve what it looks like. And I think really there was an actual market for literary work about the West starting around probably as early as 1810. And I think the Nicholas Biddle journals of the Lewis and Clark expedition, which came out in 1814, I mean, those things sold like hotcakes in the East. And I think that made people understand that, wow, okay, all I got to do is go out to the West, and write some account. And it even led to, and I have found 2 or 3 of these, what were basically made up accounts by people who never actually went to the West, but they talked to people and read other people's stuff and sat down and wrote an account of their own journey.
Like it was enough of a thing that there was value in faking one.
Yes, there was.
Yeah.
And you could sell a faked book. There's one particular guy, a guy named John Maley, who wrote a faked book about an expedition he took up the Red River, and he sold it for like $5,000 or something, which of course at the time was a huge sum of money. But the publisher he sold it to went broke in the depression of 1819, and they never did publish it. So it kind of exists just as a manuscript, which I have actually examined closely enough to realize, bullshit. This guy did not do any of this. Yeah.
But man, like it's off your subject matter, but can you just imagine that if a century prior to Lewis and Clark, you'd have taken people with that mandate and that skill set, and you had said, I want you to cross over the range divide. I want you to descend the Ohio, descend the Mississippi, come back overland.
Yeah,
On the Natchez Trace or whatever.
Yeah.
And like do your thing. Like write down about all the stuff.
And write down about all of it.
Yeah, you have to, I mean, in that era, you really have to sort through what material there is to get glimpses of the natural world. And obviously there's a literature from the earlier colonial period of, English gentlemen
but
going
a lot
up
of
the
it's
Savannah River.
indecipherable, though.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't
The
read...
William Bartram kind of stuff.
It reads as very sort of, I don't know, pre-modern. Not in the technical sense, but pre-modern. I mean, it's very antiquarian.
Yeah,
and it's
Like, you read, that's true. You read like the account of Cabeza de Vaca. And it feels like it's like an extended acid trip, like you're kind of like, what? Really? There's no way. I mean, you're kind of like, it doesn't paint a vivid picture. And I think that something, you're right, like something happened linguistically where we go over this hump and all of a sudden you can understand what people are talking about.
Yeah. And I'm pretty sure it's that a market emerged for it. There was a market, America, where we're interested in possibilities for making money. And here was this wild new country that everybody around the world, including all the Europeans, were really intrigued by. And so people began to realize, well, hell, I just, I try to keep notes. Maybe I embellish a little bit even.
Yeah.
And so I think that's kind of one of the explanations for what happens starting about 1800, 1810, that suddenly you start getting a lot more primary source accounts. You have to use them, with a grain of salt sometimes.
Well, I wasn't really aware of that, man. And you turned me on to that, to be suspicious. In studying writing, in studying fiction writing, we always learned about the unreliable narrator as a fictional device.
Yeah.
Right? Like you're reading a novel and the reader sort of becomes aware like that part of the thing is not to trust the narrator, which is common in movies and other stuff, right? Like it's a built-in tension.